Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. President Donald Trump's budget plan is out, and it has potential implications for Native Americans, especially in the area of health care. He would like to see a 75% cut in a Native diabetes program and significant reductions in IHS building construction and maintenance. This comes as hospitals, especially in rural areas, face a looming drop in Medicaid money. We'll look at potential paths forward in the rapidly shifting healthcare funding scenario. That's coming up after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Jill Freitas. Tribal leaders are raising concerns about a possible overhaul of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that could lead to more staff cuts. During a congressional hearing last week, National Congress of American Indians President Mark Macaro warned lawmakers a proposed reorganization could reduce positions critical to delivering funding and services to tribal nations. He says the plan is moving forward without meaningful consultation. Macaro told lawmakers, quote, "This action has been done without consultation with tribal nations and without the consideration of the impact it will have on the delivery of programs and services," end quote. A recent Government Accountability Office report found workforce reductions have already caused delays and left gaps in services across Indian country. Federal officials say the changes are intended to improve efficiency, but tribal leaders warn the impacts could be far-reaching. The Pueblo of Isleta could lose federal funds for its Head Start program because online betting and prediction markets are hurting the tribe's gaming revenues. U.S. Representative Gabe Vasquez for New Mexico met with tribal leaders last week to discuss the importance of preserving early education programs on sovereign Native lands. KUNM's Jeanette Didios has more.
It's recess at the Isleta Head Start, which serves children ages 3 to 5 at the Pueblo. The program offers both educational and cultural learning like traditional dancing and language learning. Native American communities must do a 20% non-federal match for their Head Start programs in order to receive the remaining 80% of their budget from the federal government. So Isleta Pueblo uses revenues from its casino gaming for the match. But tribal officials say that is now at risk because online gaming platforms use federal regulatory loopholes to offer gaming-like services nationwide, while avoiding state gaming compacts under which tribal casinos must operate. First Lieutenant Governor for the Pueblo of Isleta, Charles Jojala, says that every gaming pueblo has similar concerns.
Coming into our state, unregulated, they're not sharing any of their revenue. What people gamble, what they make, they're walking away from the state with all that money. And as far as Indian tribes go, we're required.
The Trump administration has eased Biden-era regulations on prediction markets. Representative Vasquez introduced an amendment to prohibit sports betting using prediction market models. He also co-sponsored another bill that would prohibit members of Congress and the administration from entering into contracts. He says if they don't prohibit this, it's going to lead to corruption issues.
Because now you're able to make predictions or bets on things like world events, on legislation passing, on what the president is going to do tomorrow, on what the Supreme Court case is going to decide on a case that they have before them.
Councilwoman for the Pueblo, Eulala Lucero, says this will directly impact the Pueblo's children.
This is the forefront of the foundation of their future, and it's developing their knowledge, their awareness, so that they can be stronger as they go into their next phases of education.
Vasquez says that online gaming is a clear violation and overstep of the rules that currently exist, and it will be one of his top priorities this year. For National Native News, I'm Jeanette Didios.
And I'm Jill Freitas.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Skuktash. For more than 40 years, Ramona Farms has revived ancient traditional foods, tepary beans, pinoli, polentas, and more, all from store.ramonafarms.com. Ramona Farms supports this show. Domye.
Support for law and justice-related programming provided by Hobbs, Strauss, Dean & Walker, LLP, a national law firm dedicated to promoting and defending tribal rights for over 40 years. More information available at hobbsstrauss.com.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce, hosting today's show from just a few miles north of Browning, Montana, near the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. President Donald Trump's new proposed budget for next year includes significant cuts to healthcare programs that benefit Native Americans. One of them is the Special Diabetes Program for Indians, which aims to combat high rates of the disease in Native communities. The budget also includes cuts to the Department of Health and Human Services and programs that boost rural hospitals. Some sectors could see an increase in federal funding, but critics say any increases still fall far short, especially as rural areas eye looming cuts to Medicaid reimbursements that could mean the end of hundreds of hospitals. Today on our show, we'll hear from Native health policy experts on the future of healthcare, with a focus on rural areas. Listeners, you can also join our show with comments or questions. Do you live in a rural area where healthcare options are limited? Let us know. Join the conversation by calling 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. We have three guests joining us today from the Tribal Self-Governance Conference at the Gila River Indian Community in Arizona. Joining us on Zoom is Liz Malerba. She is the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs for the United South and Eastern Tribes Sovereignty Protection Fund. She's a citizen of the Mohegan Tribe. Good morning, Liz, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Also on Zoom, we have A.C. Locklear. He is the CEO of the National Indian Health Board. He is Lumbee. A.C., welcome back to you as well, and good morning.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us is Geraldine Church. She is the president and CEO of the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board, and she is a citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. Geraldine, good morning, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Hey, honey, Weste, Madakiapi. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you and all of our guests on the show today. Liz, I want to begin with you. Overall, what stands out to you about President Trump's budget proposal for 2027, specifically with regard to healthcare?
You know, I would say it's kind of complicated. What we're seeing is a continued dedication to supporting the Indian Health Service. The Indian Health Service, under the fiscal 27 budget request, would receive $1 billion increase. That's a positive. But we're also seeing a failure to recognize how much trust and treaty obligation funding is tied up in other parts of the federal budget, including the full Department of Health and Human Services. And so while we're seeing increases to IHS, we're also seeing cuts proposed to programs that tribal nations access throughout the federal budget.
Liz, what about some of these other programs that could see significant cuts, like the Special Diabetes Program, also National Institutes of Health Research, Teen Pregnancy Prevention? Those are just a few. How significant could those cuts be on tribal communities?
Well, you know, if Congress were to enact those cuts, they would be felt deeply. You know, again, the Indian Health Service is the core of health delivery in Indian country, but we're accessing funding throughout, and you know, all of the funding lines that you mentioned have import for Indian country, and we rely on that funding. So if these cuts were to be enacted, which we aren't necessarily expecting that they will be, Indian country would feel that pretty deeply.
Hmm. And the special diabetes program, any data or indication with regard to how much of a difference that program has made?
I would say the special diabetes program for Indians is a shining star with regard to data. We struggle to collect data throughout Indian country on our programs, namely because they are so underfunded. We're often forced to choose between, administrative activities like data collection and actual program implementation. And also, because these funds are delivered to tribal nations in fulfillment of trust and treaty obligations, it's really inappropriate to require data collection as a part of them. All of this money is delivered in perpetuity for the lands and resources that we ceded to the United States. But SDPI has an excellent track record with regard to the data collected. Since its inception in the late 90s, SDPI has been a proven program to intervene in the incidence of type 2 diabetes in Indian country. We have seen the incidence of end-stage renal disease, which is both a strong indicator of unmanaged diabetes and also a very expensive illness to treat, go way down over time. And that's just one data point that shows how effective SDPI has been in our communities.
Thanks, Liz. AC Locklear, let's bring you into the conversation now. And I want to talk about the advocacy organization, the National Rural Health Association, concerned that the budget would eliminate core rural health programs such as the Rural Hospital Stabilization Program. Now, this financially supports rural hospitals. What are your thoughts on the current state of the country's rural healthcare system and these cuts? Do they benefit or potentially threaten that system?
Yeah, for sure. And, I can't get into too many specific details around some of the rural health funding, but as we know, most of our communities are in rural communities and they don't only access services through Indian Health or through their tribal facilities, but also, surrounding facilities, other, federal qualified health centers. And those are critically important when we think about population health and community health. We can't only think about the tribal members living on the reservations or in tribal communities. You're constantly engaging with folks outside of your community. We saw that during COVID. External, non-native folks living in and around tribal communities and their health outcomes are just as important to our tribal members' health outcomes. So, we need to make sure that our interventions, we need to make sure access to healthcare is available not just to our tribal members, but those outside, because that is also an indicator of health. So any reduction in services across the board is a real loss to the ability to provide for health outcomes, both for our community members and those outside of our community.
AC, the proposed budget seeks to cut over 12% of the Department of Health and Human Services overall budget. How will that cut and others potentially ripple into Indian Health Service care?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and Liz mentioned this very well from the very beginning. Outside of Indian Health Service, the amount of money that tribes receive from HHS or programs that they are involved in, a small fraction of that is specifically set aside for tribes. We've for decades, Indian country has fought to make sure that anytime there's funding available for states, localities, territories, other public health entities, that every appropriation that comes through includes comma and tribes so that they are eligible. So there is billions of dollars across HHS that tribes access that isn't specifically for tribes. So, we don't have a clear understanding of what all of those programs are across the board. And that's something that we've been working for years to try to have a clear understanding for. So anytime there are cuts to behavioral health programs, to rural health programs, to any HHS program, there is a risk that some tribes may be implicated. So, it's part, the the trust responsibility isn't just solely on Indian Health Service shoulders. It extends throughout the entire federal government across all programs. And until, tribes are fully funded in the amount of need that we have, they're dependent on a lot of these other programs across the board. So it will have a significant impact.
Okay. AC, I want to ask you one more question, and we're going to have to take a break. But the National Indian Health Board, you folks found that the Trump administration is also proposing some significant increases to healthcare funding from last year. And one is an $800 million increase to advance appropriations. Tell us why that is significant. And again, some of these other increases, to what extent could those possibly benefit Native American healthcare in the United States?
Yeah, for sure. And in a environment where we're looking at a lot of cuts across the board and we're looking at budget neutrality, an increase for Indian Health Services is huge, especially a 1.1 billion increase. And there are a lot of nuances because we're looking at $9 billion for Indian Health when our need is upwards of 70 billion. But there has been a commitment to addressing some electronic health record modernization needs, the facilities construction needs. The secretary previously, a few months ago, committed $1 billion to address the 1993 list for facilities, but there's another, 6 to 8 billion of need to finish that list, and this only there is an increase in about 200 million in this budget request, and that only scratches the surface. But we do see the administration acknowledging these priorities. And I do, and I want to clarify on the point around SDPI because it's really important to note that the president's budget request, specifically this one, is only addressing discretionary programs. So it doesn't provide for any of the mandatory programs across the federal government. SDPI is a mandatory program. So what's reflected in that budget is what has already been appropriated for the remainder of the authorization for that program. So it's authorized to the end of 2026. So that 49 number that's in there, while it looks like they are cutting significantly the amount, it's only for that short period of time that the program's still authorized.
All right. Thanks for that information. Good clarification, AC. We're going to take a short break. We'll come back and we'll talk with Geraldine Church, President and CEO of the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board. A handful of Native women are drawn to the fast-paced and full-contact sport of roller derby. As they elbow for position in the rink, they're also battling for representation in an athletic competition that reaches a very specific and loyal fan base. We'll hear about Indigenous roller derby athletes and a new film that profiles them on the next Native America Calling.
Who protects Indian country? Amerind does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Amerind helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Amerind is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. Let's continue now with our conversation on the landscape for healthcare funding, especially in rural areas. Join us with a comment or question. All you have to do is call 1-800-996-2848. That is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. And you can also continue our conversation on our website, nativeamericacalling.com, and our social media pages such as Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. Our next guest, Geraldine Church, joins us now from the Tribal Self-Governance Conference. She is the president and CEO of the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board. And Geraldine, earlier we were discussing the effect of possible cuts to the special diabetes program for Indians and what that would mean for different regions of the country. How about for the Great Plains area? How has that program benefited the tribes that you work with and represent?
Yeah, well, diabetes, our population is just proportionately impacted by diabetes. And so cutting that program would have a terrible impact. And it's also a program that has shown incredible success at being effective in helping to reduce renal disease and help our relatives manage their diabetes, and has helped to improve outcomes. So to lose that program would be devastating in our region.
Another area of concern that you have with the budget are proposed cuts to IHS's water and sanitation infrastructure. And I know that one of the tribes in your region, the Santee Sioux in Nebraska, they haven't been able to access water from their water supply for almost 7 years. How might they be impacted by this budget now?
Yes, yeah, that cut is extremely concerning. Also in our region, you're correct. Santee has been, trying to seek help and relief for their water access issues for many years. We've been by their side, advocating right along with them, but they're not alone. Much of the infrastructure in the Great Plains, especially in our rural areas, the infrastructure is antiquated and is in need of replacement, much less, improvement. So that's very concerning to me. Our direct service tribes are still, relying on these very, very old systems that can no longer meet the needs and demands of population growth over the decades. They're operating on systems that, were built 50, 60 years ago and are in dire need of replacement. So cutting an 87% cut to sanitation would be absolutely devastating.
Okay. Geraldine, I also want to talk about potential cuts to NIH research. And can you talk a little bit about how health research funding has benefited Native communities in the past, and what the current landscape is with this administration?
Sure. One of the things that we see is that there is a lack of data and a lack of research when it comes to diseases and trends specific to our population. We're often underrepresented in larger scale studies, or our representation is non-existent. So in order to be precise about what's going to work in our communities and with our population, we need research dollars. Our tribes and tribal organizations that work in this space are best situated to do that work. They know the communities. They have relationships with the families that need a better understanding of what types of interventions and what types of care is going to work best for them. And so cuts to NIH would hurt our communities. It would add to an already lack of data that exists, and would really stall what little progress that we have been able to make over the years.
Mm-hmm. Geraldine, what are you hearing from tribal leaders in the Great Plains region? What are their biggest concerns right now about healthcare, and what more do they say is needed, or maybe there are some other funding sources they're looking at?
Well, I think there's, the first and foremost is that this administration recognized that there is a trust and treaty responsibility, especially in our region where we are treaty tribes. And so tribes can decide for themselves whether that is met through direct service, or if our tribes are interested in pursuing self-governance, they need to know that the resources are going to be there, so that they are not inheriting a failing system, that they have the resources that are needed to take their healthcare system to the next level. So funding, of course, is a huge concern for our tribes that are not ready to pursue self-governance or self-determination, and still rely heavily on the Indian Health Service for care. They want to know that there's that the care that's being provided is quality health care. They want to know that there's transparency in how resources are being utilized and what's going to be done to improve health outcomes, what's going to be done to improve the extraordinarily high vacancy rates that we have at many of our direct service facilities. And, much of the resources that are allocated for rural health, such as the Rural Transformation Funds, they want to know that there's going to be, now while tribes do not have the ability to directly access those funds, they want to know that the federal government is going to ensure that the states are reaching out to Indian country and ensuring that those resources get to our tribal communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Geraldine, I want to ask you about potential changes to Medicaid, specifically for the Great Plains region, and what do you see as the potential impact there?
Well, a great majority of our population are Medicaid eligible. A lot of our tribal health systems rely on Medicaid dollars in order to expand services. There aren't a lot of Medicaid providers that are not tribal. There are hospitals and providers that will accept Medicaid, but it's limited in how many they'll accept. So our population, our communities, and our Medicaid eligible beneficiaries rely on Medicaid. And so any cuts are going to be devastating to our systems, our tribal health systems, and to our Indian health systems. It's going to be even harder for our relatives to get referrals for care that they're not able to access on the reservations. So protecting Medicaid, not only in our tribal health systems, but within our rural hospitals and clinics that are non-tribal is incredibly important.
All right, Geraldine, thank you for joining the conversation. I want to go back to Liz Malerba for one more question, and I'm going to bring in another guest. And of course, we do have our phone lines open, 1-800-99-NATIVE, for any listeners who would like to join the conversation. But Liz, I want to get a better idea of how the budget process works, because I know what the president's proposing ultimately will be negotiated. Changes will be made. What do you expect the final budget will look like? And what are the chances that this proposed budget is adopted as it's presented right now?
That's a great question, Sean. I'm optimistic about what will ultimately shake out as the fiscal 27 budget process continues. And I'm optimistic because of what shook out in the fiscal 26 process. So last year, around the same time, the administration proposed pretty deep cuts to federal Indian programs, many of them. It's important to underscore that the president's budget is simply a request. Congress maintains the power of the purse, meaning only Congress can appropriate federal dollars. And so now that the president's budget request is out for fiscal 27, we turn to our partners in Congress and we work with them to ensure that increases that are being proposed for Indian country, such as the increases to the Indian Health Service, are enacted, and also to ensure that decreases are not included in final fiscal 27 appropriations. We have a lot of allies on Capitol Hill in the appropriations committees, namely House Appropriations Committee Chair Tom Cole, who is a citizen of Chickasaw, and they have a deep, deep understanding of the federal government's trust and treaty obligations to Indian country and are committed to ensuring that the federal government delivers better for Indian country. They have proven themselves to be committed to, working within their own limitations to ensure that Indian country is protected throughout this process and that we do receive increases in funding, or at the very least, do not fall victim to decreases in funding. So ultimately, I do not believe that many of the proposed cuts in the president's budget will be enacted by Congress.
All right. Thank you, Liz. I'd like to introduce a fourth guest now, Kurt Riley, who joins us from Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico. He is the chairman of the Acoma Pueblo Health Board. Of course, he's also a citizen of Acoma Pueblo and a former governor of Acoma Pueblo as well. Kurt, hello, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Now, I know recently the current governor of Acoma testified before the U.S. House Appropriations about challenges with your health facility there, the healthcare facility in Acoma. What are the main concerns, and what have been the challenges since taking over the clinic from the Indian Health Service a few years ago?
Well, it's a long history of our road to assumption, but I'll try to be brief. The Pueblo sued the federal government originally because the facility was a combined service unit servicing three major tribes: Acoma, Canoncito, Band of Navajo, and Laguna Pueblo. The other two tribes had previously 638'd their tribal shares, and so the Pueblo of Acoma was the last one to have any shares available. And this is post-COVID and is also during the government shutdown. As a consequence, the Pueblo became very concerned and charged the health board to monitor the facility's operations and to advise them as to options to consider for the future. And we provided those to the Pueblo Tribal Council. And they decided to go down the road of assumption and charge the health board to do that. Once we assumed operations on August 1st, of last year, we really realized how IHS had neglected the facility. And being a former IHS employee, I can understand from the internal operations as to reasons why. However, that does not negate the responsibility of the federal government through IHS to operate a facility as optimally as they can. The facility needed a lot of maintenance and repair, which had not been done. They had a high vacancy rate, almost 47%. Services were being reduced. Access was very limited, although available. And so once we assumed, it was during the latter part of the federal closure to close the fiscal year books. We did not receive any federal funding for the first 2 months that we assumed operations. The Pueblo Council provided us with those resources to open, and of course, meeting our payroll. Afterwards, when we did receive federal funding, we were then able to provide for payroll. We were also identifying the facility and the adjacent housing units. It did come with a housing unit as a recruitment incentive. And so right now we're going to make a complete assessment of not only the facility but also the housing units. We have begun recruitment, and so we have decreased that down to about 17% vacancy, and our C-suite is pretty complete. We have our chief medical officer, chief executive officer, chief operations officer, and our CEO, of course. And so the only position that we have vacant currently is our chief financial officer. So we're on our way, difficult as it may be.
Okay. Kurt, we're going to take a short break, but we'll come back and we'll talk more about this. And for our listeners who might not be familiar with Acoma Pueblo, Acoma is located about 70 miles west of Albuquerque, right along Interstate 40. And to the west of Acoma, about another 10 miles, is Grants, New Mexico. And then about another hour past there is Gallup, of course. So we're going to ask Kurt about just how important this healthcare facility is for Acoma people in that region and what the other options are, how far they have to drive perhaps to other hospitals in the event that they need to do so. But first, we're going to take a short break. We'll come back and continue this conversation. And we have the phone lines open for any listeners who would like to join us. Of course, that number is 1-800-99-NATIVE. Just pick up the phone, give us a call, share your thoughts with regard to the proposed budget right now coming through the Trump administration and what it might mean for healthcare in your part of the country, the Native community that you live in or you represent or you call home. So again, that number, 1-800-996-2848. We'll be right back. Stay with us, folks.
Support by the Gathering of Nations Powwow. The last dance is this April 24th and 25th at Expo, New Mexico. The Gathering of Nations Traders Market will be in the Creative Arts and Lujan buildings both days. Tickets available at gatheringofnations.com and at the gates.
Need help identifying community priorities? Kaufman & Associates' approach to evaluation is rooted in indigenous knowledge, honoring tribal history, and sovereignty. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
You are listening to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce, and we're taking a look today at rural health care and how Native patient care could change with President Trump's proposed budget for 2027. You can listen back to this show and all of our past shows on our website, nativeamericacalling.com. And of course, you can also access us on all major podcast platforms. We have Kurt Riley on the line right now in Acoma Pueblo. He's the chairman of the Acoma Pueblo Health Board. He's also a former governor of Acoma Pueblo. And Kurt, just before break, you gave us an update on the facility there at Acoma, and it sounds like things are going well. You're definitely getting some positions staffed. But I also want to ask you about just the importance of that facility for the folks that use that healthcare in that region. Because I know, again, like I mentioned, Acoma's, it's not very close to Albuquerque or any other major city.
That's correct, Sean, and thank you for the question. The facility is really not just servicing the Pueblo of Acoma. I recently asked our staff to give us an update, at least myself, for this program, to get a profile of the individuals that are coming to our facility currently. And of course, Acoma is number one as far as patient visits, but we also service Laguna, Navajo Nation, Santo Domingo, and Zuni, and those are the top 5 tribal communities members that are coming to our facility. And averaging, based on just a few months that we are open, we're seeing on average 740 individuals a month. So it's not just a facility just for Acoma, and that has been the position of the board since day one. We will provide services to any qualified Native or Alaska Native if they choose to come to our facility. So it, as you said, Sean, it is a regional facility. It's accessible. It's and we're open, and that's what we have contracted for, is to provide services to anyone who needs our services.
And Kurt, in a situation where somebody can't make it to your healthcare facility, where do they go? What's the next closest option? Is it grants, or do they maybe go back to Albuquerque?
It's really dependent on their circumstances. As with other tribal nations, transportation for individuals and families is always an issue. When our clinic is closed, the closest place is grants at the Cibola General Hospital. If in an emergency, our EMS will respond and usually transport to Cibola General, where if it's a small rural hospital. Granted, they've expanded services, but depending on the patient's circumstances, they may be flown or even transported by ambulance into Albuquerque. Albuquerque for New Mexico houses the only level 1 trauma center, which is the University of New Mexico Hospital, but it has other facilities within the metro area under UNM and Presbyterian and Lovelace. So that is the major hub for medical services in New Mexico.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for explaining that, Kurt. Because again, just giving our listeners a better understanding of the region there and some of the distances they have to travel and some of the other challenges. Now, before Acoma took over the facility, you and some other people, you met with other rural hospitals and clinics there in New Mexico. And what did you learn about the struggles with keeping rural clinics afloat? And what are your concerns for the future now?
As with any endeavor with Native tribes, it's always the capacity, the ability of resources, whether it be human or financial, to keep any facility afloat. Much like what has been expressed by some of my fellow guests, recruitment has always been an issue. For us as Native people, we go out our back doors, and there may be nothing there, but it's nature, it's our land, we're home. For others, they want the conveniences of urban life, and so it depends on your perspective, and that's why we have tried to heavily recruit Native professionals, and we have, and so we try to offer them as well a compensation. That's what we learned with our study. And it's true anywhere in rural America. You have to increase your salaries in order to compensate people for coming to the community. However, and this goes into not only recruitment, but it also goes to community members. The social determinants of health also reflect back into the social reasons why people take jobs. Housing availability, affordable housing availability, economic development, maybe employment for spouses or children. Is it safe? So public safety and health. And so these are not only issues for tribes, but it also reflects back to recruitment for staff to provide the services. We can't do without that.
Kurt, you mentioned the importance of housing. Are you able to provide some sort of resident housing for staff that come to work at the hospital, or other options that are available?
We do have housing, which was provided when IHS built the facility. They recognized that the need for housing locally near the facility was important for their recruitment. We inherited housing units, and some were in I guess, transitioning for renovation. Others, we have had experiences where these facilities were built in the 70s, so some settlement of the foundation, modernization of the housing units. We have to take a look at. So yes, housing is available, but we are, as I said before, we are looking towards a complete evaluation of not only the medical facility, but the housing units as well, to bring them up to a better standard so we can use them as a recruitment tool as well.
Okay. Now, you had shared earlier that the clinic has an adequate number of staff, and that's going in the right direction. But what other challenges do you think will persist without more federal funding? And again, going back to this proposed budget, if a lot of these cuts go through, what are you most worried about?
It's really difficult to just look at IHS without looking at all the others, as one of the other guests had mentioned. You have to look at all of the federal funding from all of the different agencies in order to be able to access those resources. Any cut anywhere is always going to hurt us. But I think the overall really issue that I personally am worried about is the Affordable Care Act funding. That allowed for individuals who are not only on Medicaid, but maybe don't qualify for full Medicaid, but through the network, we're able to afford reasonable health care coverage. And as someone else said, if that goes away, we're all going to be hurting. It's not going to be just Native-run facilities, but real community hospitals, major medical centers are going to suffer as a consequence. People are going to be coming to us that are in worse shape medically because they haven't gotten the preventive care. They haven't been able to access maybe primary care. They haven't been able to maybe afford their medications. And so any reduction in the funding that came out of the Affordable Care Act, we're going to feel that, and we won't be able to be reimbursed for the services that we provide. And that goes across the board, across the country. That's what I'm personally worried about. Because what that will mean is that we're going to have to provide services as well as we can with the limited now federal budget that we have, which means we're going to have to reduce our staff. We're going to have to reduce our services. And so I'm not looking forward to that. We're lucky, at least here in the state of New Mexico, that the state government has put a stopgap proposal in place. But I don't think that is for the long term sustainable. It's going to help in the short term, but not in the long term. And as you said, the Congress has the power of the purse, and I'm also looking forward to Congress really maintaining their commitment to us as far as Native Americans and Alaska Natives, and to maintain that funding and not reduce drastically the funding cuts that are proposed currently by the president's budget.
All right, Kurt, thank you for joining the show today. Really appreciate you taking the time to educate our listeners. I want to go back now to AC Locklear with the National Indian Health Board. And AC, one topic we haven't talked about yet today is that the president is also calling for more investment to modernize electronic healthcare records. And I'm interested in learning how that might help the Indian Health Service and also some of these rural clinics we're talking about today, like Acoma Pueblo, for example, that are dealing now with aging record keeping systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And, IHS has been going through the process for electronic health record modernization for over a decade. The RPMS system that's currently used is no longer able to keep up with the complex systems and processes that's needed in many of our facilities. And it's really causing issues. If people are printing off their health records and having to carry them from location to location, and it's really in a day when everyone has access to most of their medical records on their phone, or can do their prescriptions on their phone, or get access to lab results immediately. It really causes another level of access issues for Indian country. Unfortunately, problem is that the total need to complete this project is around $62 billion, and we're far away from that. IHS has selected a partner to has selected a system that they are using but they have only received incremental increases here and there for electronic health record modernization. The amount requested this year, which reflected a $96 million increase, um, the total need is far, far greater. Um, so in order to really be able to get that done, we're going to need some special appropriations, but it is good that the president's budget shows that commitment because it shows that Indian country really needs uh, modernizing electronic health records because it is the underlying, part of the infrastructure for health.
Absolutely. And AC, we've got a couple of minutes before we have to wrap up. And I do want to talk a little bit more about potential cuts to Medicaid. We talked about them a little bit earlier, but of course, Medicaid is both a federal and a state managed program. And what do tribes need to keep in mind, specifically with regard to, again, they also need to look at the states and maintain those partnerships as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Any cuts to Medicaid is detrimental for Indian country. It's the only thing that's able to keep our systems going. It's the primary funder for both Indian Health Service and tribal facilities. So any cuts in the ability, we have had good luck working with Congress to make sure that the cuts do not impact Indian country. So, for example, and many of the other regulatory requirements that they've put into place. But that doesn't mean it's always going to be like that. So we'll continue working with our partners on the Hill and working with the administration to make sure those cuts do not impact Indian health. But that's the only, that's the largest singular source of funding for our systems. And we can't keep the doors open without that Medicaid and Medicare funding.
All right. Thank you, AC. And Liz Malerba, back to you. I'm going to give you the closing words today on the show because it's also important to note that there are other proposals in this budget outside of healthcare. Which of those areas are you most concerned about, and what can you share with our listeners?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I would say so the budget is still being released. We don't have all of the details yet, but two other items of concern. This budget proposes to reduce Bureau of Indian Affairs funding by almost $750 billion. So while we're seeing a real commitment to funding the Indian Health Service, BIA is not receiving that same treatment in the president's budget request. And then also within the Department of the Interior, funding for tribal historic preservation is proposed to be eliminated. And this is hugely problematic, especially because at the same time, the administration is wanting to deploy a lot of traditional energy infrastructure. They're wanting to do a lot of resource extraction. And anytime you're seeing infrastructure deployed within the United States, whether it's traditional energy or renewable energy or federal buildings, there is a requirement for tribal cultural reviews on those sites to ensure that we're able to protect our sacred sites and our cultural resources, as well as our public health. And our tribal historic preservation officers are leading the charge on that. They are already radically underfunded. They are already asked to do so much with so little. And this budget would eliminate funding entirely. And so those are two of the items that we're really going to be working with Congress on to ensure that those cuts do not happen.
And with that, we have now reached the end of our hour. So I want to thank all of the guests who joined us on the show today: Liz Malerba, AC Locklear, Geraldine Church, and Kurt Riley. And don't forget, please join us again tomorrow as we hear from Native women in the full contact sport of roller derby. Until then, I'm your host, Sean Spruce. Enjoy the rest of your day. You've been listening to the one, the only Native America Calling.
Support from Davis Keelan Law Firm, a New Mexico firm standing with Native families suffering catastrophic loss. When tragedy strikes Indian country, Davis Keelan fights to restore stability, dignity, and justice, bringing a voice to Native families and communities for 20 years. More information, daviskeelan.com.
Tribal Development Partners believe strong infrastructure strengthens tribal sovereignty. Through the 105L lease program, TDP helps align federal funding systems with long-term tribal priorities. More at tribaldevpartners.com. Proud to support this show.
Every family caregiver could use help finding the necessary resources to care for their loved one. The AARP Family Caregiver Resource Guide helps family caregivers access key programs, services, and agencies in their communities. A copy of the guide is available by calling 877-333-5885 or online at aarp.org/caregiver-resources. AARP supports this show.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.